So today I'm going to talk about the role of understanding motivations in the illegal wildlife trade. As we all know, wildlife is in crisis, and a lot of that is to do with the illegal wildlife trade and overexploitation. I don't want to give you too many nasty pictures of dead animals this time in the morning, so I've just written it in words. So the illegal wildlife trade is worth, this was a few years ago now, $8 to $10 billion per year. And that places it fourth after drugs, arms, and other things. And that is not including timber and fisheries. So that's just straightforward wildlife trade. And I've given you some examples here of some of the casualties of that trade. And of course, the saiga is in there. So, unfortunately, there's been a strong response to this and a very controversial response. And one of those things that's happened is the militarization of anti-poaching and the expression of combating the wildlife trade as a kind of war. And this has had quite a lot of debate. So on one side, this book here is talking about the problems of this war, and the other one, and how you need to fight it. And the one on the other side is by a political ecologist who is expressing some caution as to whether this is going to throw away 20 years' worth of work with communities. So that's on the supply side, trying to tackle the hunters. On the demand side, there's been a lot of work to raise public awareness in the demanding countries, particularly in Southeast Asia. So these kinds of pictures spread around. So in some senses, these are concerning because we don't know really whether that is actually the image that is needed in order to change the thoughts and behaviour of consumers. But in some cases, it's even verging on the unethical. And I would say that this one, for example, is pretty much in the unethical box. So there's been a lot of work on the demand side, and as I'll be talking about later, perhaps more work needs to be done. Many of you probably were aware at the end of last month of the very exciting things that were happening at the CITES conference of the parties in Johannesburg, and the many discussions that were happening and debates about elephants, sharks, and other species. I found this interesting. This was a newspaper article that was written by a South African journalist about the outcomes of the conference of the parties for CITES. And what I found particularly interesting was this phrase near the end, when he was talking about what it was that was causing people to make decisions. And I found particularly depressing this sentence here. When few care about a species, its fate was quickly decided on the science. When people do care about the species, the fate is not decided on the science, is what I take away from that. So just to finish this introduction, I think we need to all think about how do we make our science count? How do we make it so that the science is used particularly in species where we care, and not just in the species where nobody cares? And we need to ask ourselves, are we doing the right science? Is our science reaching the right people at the right time? Or is there a fundamental problem that people don't want to hear our science unless it agrees with what they already think? Okay, so before we start thinking further about that, we need to think what we mean by illegal trade. And I think the first thing to think about is that illegal wildlife trade covers a huge range of things. It covers things that are sold for food, for pets, for medicine, for luxury. It covers local and international markets. It even covered things that are farmed and things that are wild-caught. And these markets for farmed and wild-caught species intertwine in complicated ways. And before we start, we need to think that things that are repulsive to us are not necessarily illegal. So that might be the bear bile trade, for example. And things that are informal are not necessarily legal. And that is things like a lot of bushmeat trade. And things that are illegal are not necessarily unsustainable. So we need to think carefully about, when we're thinking about the illegal, unsustainable trade, what it is we really mean. We need to think similarly carefully about motivations of the people who are using these species and people who are catching them. Because I think understanding how people view the world is the key to changing their behaviour. But the woman who is buying a bangle in Hong Kong is going to have very different motivations to the woman who is buying bushmeat in order to feed her family. And similarly, a hunter in Equatorial Guinea here is going to have different motivations to the trader in Sulawesi and the illegal logger in Cambodia. So the complexity of this trade brings research challenges for us. I've already explained the complexity of the markets, so it's hard to know who we're trying to target. But when we're thinking about the illegal market, research is very challenging because of the illegality, so it's very hard to talk to people about it directly. Many of these markets have cultural and economic factors which intertwine in a complex way. And add to that, we have rapid changes in these markets due to changing prosperity amongst the consumers and changing accessibility of the markets and accessibility of the forests for the hunters. So we may say, oh, this is all very complicated, we need 10 years of research in order to understand this. But as I pointed out earlier, interventions are continuing nonetheless. And if we want to be relevant, then we need to start informing these interventions. Okay, so going on to my talk now, I'm going to be using examples from the supply side and from the demand side to illustrate how you can understand motivations. So first talking about hunters living around protected areas in Uganda, and then about rhino horn demand reduction in Viet Nam. And I hope also to illustrate how you can use methods from many different subjects in order to try to shed light on these motivations. So the first one is talking about the profiles and motivations of illegal resource users at Bwindi in Uganda, which is a place where we have great trade-offs between conservation of a critically endangered species and human livelihoods. And this research was led by Mario Harrison. So we have a problem that we are assuming that illegal wildlife trade is a threat to biodiversity. And in order to address that, we do two things. We either do law enforcement or some kind of community-based conservation. In this case, we do both. So we're interested to see whether the combination of law enforcement and community conservation is going to lead to less illegal activity. And in Bwindi, we're seeing that people are continuing with illegal resource use, so we need to know who will do it and why are they doing it despite these conservation interventions. So just to give you some background on Bwindi, it's highly biodiverse. It was gazetted as a national park a while ago. It is home to half the world's population of the critically endangered mountain gorilla. So from the conservation side, the stakes could not be higher. But this is a particularly telling picture which shows the border of the national park with farming right up to the edge. It's an area of very high population with a large amount of subsistence farming, which has led to conflict between the park and the people, which is ongoing. So we're interested to find out who was involved, what resources they were using, and why. We did a household survey using an indirect method, which I'll come back to explaining, to find out who. And we used focus group discussions to find out more about why. It was particularly useful here because we had not only the general population, but we could also access poachers themselves through focus groups. We could look at the known unauthorised resource users who had been arrested in the past, and authorised resource users who were allowed to go into the park, to the borders of the park, to collect certain items. Okay, so come back, the unmatched count technique. This is a really useful method for getting information about illegal activity in a way that means that people do not have to confess. So you have here a list of items, things that people do. So in this case, this is ways in which you might get meat. You have two cards. One is a control card that doesn't include the sensitive behaviour. And the other is the treatment card that does include the sensitive behaviour, in this case, bushmeat. Randomly, you will give a person either the treatment or the control card, and they are asked, how many of these things have you done in the last 12 months? Don't tell me which, just tell me how many. And that means that they don't have to confess, because if they say 3, you don't know which 3 of these there are. So having randomly assigned people to one or other of these cards, you can then get the number of items that people say on average in the treatment card, the number that they say on average in the control card, and the difference is the prevalence of that activity. So in Bwindi, this is the result, and you can see that there's a high prevalence over the last 12 months of people who have eaten bushmeat, nearly a quarter of households. And then there are other illegal activities that also have relatively high prevalence. Medicinal herbs and honey are things that do have authorization for some people, and the only one where it's close to the proportion that you would expect from authorization is honey. So we do have a major problem with illegal activity. So in terms of who is involved, generally we found from this survey that it was poor and marginalised households, which is not perhaps surprising, who are closer to the park than the average, who are more likely to live more remotely than the average, and who have larger household size, which is a sign of poverty. So we could use our focus groups, our surveys, and construct some kind of understanding of what it is that was causing people to poach. So to do illegal resource use. So our original assumption was that this was to do with poverty, and they were using this meat for their subsistence uses. What we found out was that crop raiding was an incredibly important component of poverty. So crop raiding by animals from the park meant that people had no food or income and no compensation, which led to poverty. So that's straightforward, and you can see here a quote that suggested that if you have no harvest, you go to the forest to get meat instead. But another theme started to emerge quite strongly, which was a theme of anger. So because there is no management by the National Parks Authority, people get angry, and that is why they go to the forest. Another thing you can see here, some children who are guarding their fields, and that meant that they don't get education. And that education leads to lack of employment, which leads to more poverty. And that also leads to anger. So if you don't get employment, you feel angry and you go and destroy the forest. Another thing that caused anger, which was unexpected, was the conservation itself. So the conservation is through sharing of revenues from the park with local communities. But people found that that revenue was not being shared evenly, and in fact it was going to the elite within society, and that made people angry to go and get their own compensation. So revenue sharing is 20% of the park entrance fees, which is supposed to be shared, and on top of that, in Bwindi, there's a gorilla levy. For every gorilla permit, $5 is supposed to go to the community. And it's supposed to be invested in projects that benefit everybody. Unfortunately, that's not true. So corruption leads to people living closer to the park, not getting compensation, leads to negative attitudes towards the park, leads to people feeling that they should go and compensate themselves. So the two conservation interventions are supposed to address that by providing equitable and fair benefits and also negative incentives. Those negative incentives cause more negativity towards the park. The implementation of the conservation, if it's not equitable, causes more negativity towards the park. If it is, then potentially you get positive attitudes and wealth. And there was a bit of evidence that that would lead to people refraining from illegal resource use. So schools have been built, and when you have money, you don't need to go to the forest. So that was a pretty damning conclusion about the role of conservation in causing negativity, in causing some of the damage from conservation. And in particular, we found that people were not given the permits they should have been to go and do their authorised resource use. And the positive thing that comes out of that was that this research was done in the collaboration with the Uganda Wildlife Authority, and actually within 6 months they had done a full review of permit allocation, issued new identity cards, and doubled the community share of the gorilla levy. That's not actually addressing the fundamental issue that we addressed, that we found, which was inequity, but it's a start. So once you've found out what the problems are, the next step is to talk to local people about what kinds of intervention they themselves would prefer. So trying to think more predictively and think more forwardly about how to change conservation. And this is work that is done by Henry Travers, my postdoc, and Geoffrey Mwede, who works for Wildlife Conservation Society in Uganda. So this is a new project that's covered 2 different protected areas, Murchison Falls and Queen Elizabeth, which are very beautiful and, again, very touristy. They have similar problems, and in fact their illegal resource use is even higher than at Bwindi. So you can see 43% of households had hunted bushmeat to sell in these parks over the last year. So this is a serious problem. Okay, so asking them about what they would like to do, we conducted a choice experiment. And in order to illustrate choice experiments, let me think about the lovely ice cream that I had last night in Matterday and which ice cream you would prefer to be given a choice. And there are various attributes of these ice creams that would determine whether or not you would prefer to have this one or the other one. So maybe you like chocolate a lot. Maybe you don't want anything too large. Maybe you don't like liquid dripping down your ice cream into your hand, so you'd rather have a cone. Maybe price changes your mind. So each of these ice creams have a range of attributes which together determine which one you would prefer to buy. So that is what a choice experiment is. You present people with a range of attributes at different levels, so chocolate, no chocolate, expensive, cheap, and together they determine the choice that you make about one or other thing. So here we're extending that to policies for conservation, and these are our 5 attributes, and these were taken from Uganda Wildlife Authority's strategic plan for 2014, and also from some things that we were interested to test. So the first one was just to divert existing revenues from community development, so from schools and things like that, to crop raiding. So no more money, but the money is diverted towards addressing one of those issues which is very important to the local people. The second one is to employ eco-guards, so local community members, to chase away wild animals and to act as a liaison between the park and the villages. The next thing is about changing the probability of being caught poaching in the park, so a negative incentive. The next one was one that we were interested to test, which was to extend the authorised resource user scheme to include bushmeat. And the last one was to set up wildlife-friendly enterprises in the villages, so agriculture, chili, honey, that kind of thing. Okay, and then people have to choose between one or other scenario in which the levels of these attributes are randomly distributed. And I've just circled the ones that are current at the moment, and then you see other options. And people have to choose scenario 1 or scenario 2. Okay, so this is very new research, so I've just got preliminary results, but they're very interesting to me. So interestingly, the thing that was most preferred was actually diverting money to human-wildlife conflict mitigation. So no new money, but just diversion of money. People also like the eco-guards and the wildlife-friendly enterprises. Interestingly, they also preferred to have increased enforcement. So local people were not against enforcement of the park. Disappointingly for me and my research team, none of them liked our idea, which was regulated hunting for bushmeat, but you can't win them all. So the outcome now is that we're in the process, actually, this week, of working with the Uganda Wildlife Authority to update their action plans based upon these results in a way that is more focused towards communities and less towards just doing law enforcement. Okay, so that was at the supply end, and now we're going to shift to the demand side. Thinking about how do you reduce demand for wildlife products, and I'm thinking particularly in Southeast Asia. And I think the most important message is that you need to think from the perspective of the consumer and not just from our perspective. And if you remember back to those posters I showed you at the beginning, when you have a picture of a grand rhino and saying this is not medicine, I think that's the kind of thing that comes from our perspective, not from the consumer's perspective. And I'm giving you here an example of something that was done from the consumer's perspective, which I think is a groundbreaking advertising campaign called the Chi campaign, which is appealing to businessmen who are using rhino horn in order to make themselves look more important to their business colleagues. So this is one example of a Chi campaign poster, explaining that your character comes from within and not from horn. And here's another one. Interestingly, this was done by Traffic, and importantly, their logo does not appear anywhere on these posters. The posters are very clean and not related to conservation. So I think that the demand reduction side of the wildlife trade is way behind perhaps some of the other areas of wildlife trade research. And in particular, we find it very difficult to know whether an intervention has caused an impact. That doesn't mean that NGOs aren't prepared to claim impact. And you can see here, this was a campaign claim from one of the NGOs working in Viet Nam, which suggested that rhino horn demand had dropped by a third in 1 year on the basis of their posters. I don't really believe that at all. Firstly, it's one intervention among many. They did a survey of 1,000 people amongst large numbers of cities in Vietnam. And you think, if you've got many different interventions going, and the interventions in general are raising awareness of the illegality of something, asking a few people a direct question is likely to lead to them not admitting doing something. So I think more and better science is needed in order to make these kinds of attribution claims. And that is where academic researchers come in. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of work that we've been doing. So this is work that was done by Allegra Almeida. And what she was interested in was finding out whether the demand reduction initiatives that are currently happening in Vietnam are following best practice or not. We chose Vietnam because this is where everyone has poured in. There are many demand reduction initiatives going on there at the moment for rhino horn. In fact, there are 10 that operate all at the same time in one place. And I've just listed them there by a range of different NGOs. So we wanted to try to understand whether those NGOs were actually using best practice in implementing these kinds of campaigns to change behaviour. So she did open-ended interviews with people who were implementing these projects and used those to develop a demand reduction wheel, which was trying to explain the process of how you would go about an intervention to change behaviour. And then she looked at whether the implementers were actually doing what they said they thought should be done. So it's quite straightforward. You first define your goals and your measurable objectives. Then you do research to understand your target group. Then, based upon that research, you do your pre-testing and you design your intervention. You then use that to develop a theory of change. So how do you think your intervention is going to change the way that people behave? And what indicators would you use for success? Then you do your project and record those indicators. You evaluate whether the indicators show that your goals have been achieved, and you go around again. And that's standard best practice in behaviour change. So here's the results of which of these interventions. They're completely fine with us showing this, by the way. I'm quite surprised. Which ones are doing it? So Traffic comes out very well. They're the only one that have set themselves some measurable objectives, which is pretty shocking in the first place. Only about half of them did any research before they did, of any kind, before they did their intervention. Most of them knew who their target audience was. Some of them had some evidence and had a model, a theoretical model of understanding what to do. Most of them didn't have a theory of how their intervention was going to change people's behaviour. Only one of them had indicators of success, 2 of them evaluated. That's quite shocking because that's millions and millions of dollars of money. Those who did have indicators of performance, most of them were indicators of input, such as the number of people attending workshops, or output, those people saying that they liked what they had heard, not outcomes, behaviour change. So this might be new to conservation, but it's not new to many other fields. So for example, in health research, they have a very clear methodology for interventions in public health. And that's something that can be followed. in order to design interventions that can produce measurable behaviour change. But in order to do that, we researchers need to be in from the very beginning to support the design and the baseline research. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to talk about consumer relationships with horn and with ivory as one example of how you might do this. And this was work that was done by Vian Sharif, who's a PhD student. She's interesting because she came from a background in marketing of luxury goods. So she understands this market in a way that I really don't. So she's comfortable with Gucci handbags. So her thought was that for some consumers at least, ivory and rhino horn is also a luxury good in Vietnam. And it's something that you can look at using similar methods to the way in which you understand marketing of luxury brands. So she was using concepts that come from research in the business schools, in marketing research. So one kind of thing is brand attachment and aversion. So how do people feel about brands? And this is a good proxy for actual behaviour, actual purchase behaviour. And the second thing was emotional territory mapping. So how do people connect emotionally to products? I'm just going to report a very early pilot study, which was 460 readers of high-end magazines in Viet Nam. So these are the target audience if you're thinking about luxury goods. Okay, so the first thing is to do these questionnaires, which give you some idea of people's psychological needs and how they are fulfilled by these products, whether it be wildlife or handbags. So you just ask them to agree or disagree with things like, such and such helps me to express my identity. The majority of people in my business circle think this thing is a prestigious gift. This improves the quality of my life. It helps me to appreciate my heritage. It connects to me emotionally. So those psychological needs go into a brand attachment awareness aversion score. Other questions which ask more about how these things are part of who you are. So do I feel connected? Do I feel that it's part of me, this brand? And then the other set that I've down here is more about how quickly your feelings come to light. So how automatic they are, and that shows how attached you are. Okay, so to come to some results. First of all, which goods do people desire who read high-end magazines in Vietnam? Not surprisingly, the most desirable popular good was leading electronics products. And the second most desirable good was designer fashion. Very few people put ivory or rhino horn as their first most desirable good, which I suppose is good and perhaps not surprising. When asked questions about their most desirable good and about ivory and rhino horn, these are results. So this is the attachment aversion score, which comes from a principal components analysis of those scores that people were answering questions about. So this end means attached, this end means averted. You can see for the most desirable good, people are mostly attached, which is good. Whereas for ivory and for rhino horn, for ivory people are mostly indifferent, so neither attached nor averted, whereas for horn they're slightly averted. You can categorise these more clearly. So here we have, for the most desirable good, mostly attached and ambivalent. For ivory and horn, again, mostly indifferent. But we have some people who are attached, averted, or indifferent. The psychological needs that people are seeing fulfilled from their most desirable good is all sorts of things: pleasure, gifting, community. With ivory and rhino horn, it was very clear that it was about identity, the senses, so physical feelings when they're touching the thing, and prestige. This is just for ivory because the sample size was too small for horn. So what I've done here is shown the correlations. So green is a positive correlation, red is a negative correlation, blue is neutral, no correlation, and the shading shows the strength of the correlation. So darker green, stronger. So what we can see first is that ambivalent and attached people are pretty similar. So they feel that there's a positive, ivory has a positive effect on their senses and is felt positively as a prestige good. Whereas people who are indifferent and averted feel more negatively about them. People who are indifferent feel very negatively. Interestingly, the averted people feel much less negatively, and that both that and the ambivalent one suggest that people might not be answering completely honestly, because it seems perhaps that the ambivalent people are more likely attached, and the averted are perhaps trying to cover their actual averted nature. So, the next thing you can think about is emotional territory mapping. So that is asking them to think about whether these words that we put down are actually associated or not with their goods. So you can see that for the most desirable good, the words most associated were high quality and luxury. For ivory, the most associated words were rare and high quality. And for rhino horn, it was high quality and overpriced. Before we started the questionnaire, we asked people to free list, just to give some words that they associated with goods. So that first box is words that they associate with electronic products, and the woman is words they associate with the fashion goods. So these are all as expected, perhaps. And these are the words that were associated with elephants and rhinos. And you can see very, very clearly rich and man come up very, very strongly. Another thing we wanted to find out was who influences the respondents. And that's important when you're starting to plan interventions. So we gave a list of the potential influencers of respondents. And we were looking at the free listing results. And we looked at whether people mentioned wealth in their free listing and whether they use negative words in the free listing. So what we can see here is that people who mentioned wealth in the free listing were more likely to have been influenced by campaigning organisations and the media, so perhaps by the conservation organisations who have been putting out these posters, and they were more likely to mention wealth if they'd been influenced by these people, and also by their family and friends. Really interestingly, those who didn't mention negative words, so those who didn't give negative words, were more likely to have been influenced by colleagues at work. And that sort of supports the presumption of the NGOs that a lot of the people who are using wildlife products are being influenced to do so by people at work. So that was a pilot study. There's more to come, but I thought interesting to start with anyway. So I've talked about the hunters, the people at one end, and the consumers, the people at the other end. But of course there's a missing middle. And I have to say I haven't worked on the missing middle, but I think that what's needed here is much more thought about criminology and political science. And someone does need to go in and start thinking about that. So one way that can be done, for example, is to use social network analyses. That's commonly used in criminology. So this is a social network analysis for a methamphetamine ring in Australia, and showing who is key to keeping that network going. Okay, so I've given you a kind of brief sweep through some research that we've been done about motivations. And I'd just like to now move on to talk a little bit about what challenges I think are here for those of you, hopefully, who are interested to continue this kind of research. So the first thing that's important is to realise that we do have many uncertainties in the wildlife trade literature, and that's a kind of necessity given that the kind of thing that we're looking at. But I think instead of being concerned about the uncertainties, we should embrace them and think about which of those uncertainties are really key and which ones are going to change policy, and focus the uncertainties of those. Focus your research on those uncertainties. Another thing that would be possible would be to look at policies along with stakeholders and give the best scientific research to them so that they can make their decisions more in a more evidence-based way. And particularly we need to think about the fact that these goods are illegal. And again, we can't ignore that and just ask people direct questions and expect to get a good answer. So we need to use methods like indirect questioning that I've showed you, but also triangulate between data sets. So you can get surveys, you can get arrest data, you can get poaching signs, and together they will give you a better picture. I hope I've convinced you that it's important to understand motivations and to use lessons from a range of different sources to understand those motivations. And the Chi campaign, I think, is a good example of that. I think we need to embrace heterogeneity and explore heterogeneity. So there are many different commodities, actors, motivations and market types. If we try to do one thing for everybody, it's not going to work. And that means that we need methodological novelty, interdisciplinary approaches and new techniques that will allow us to reduce bias. And I've given you some examples of those. So choice experiments, we've also been doing behavioural games and various other things. So there's lots and lots of exciting methodological novelty for those of you like me who enjoy that kind of thing. I hope from my example of the rhino horn interventions in Viet Nam, I've shown that it's fundamentally important to improve the monitoring and evaluation of interventions that are being put in place, that are costing a lot of money and perhaps diverting us from more effective ones. And that means that we as academics need to get in at the beginning and help people to produce their theories of change, to understand why they think their intervention is going to have an effect, and then use appropriate designs like before-after control intervention designs in order to see if that effect has actually happened. Thinking more broadly, I think transdisciplinarity, as was mentioned in the opening talks, is fundamental. So using approaches and colleagues from other disciplines. One thing that gets me very cross in the wildlife trade debate is the amount of theorisation that goes on in absence of empirical data. So I've been sent papers to review that use theoretical models, the same theoretical model, to produce diametrically opposite conclusions about whether rhino horn trade, for example, should be legal or not. And the reason why those theoretical models can produce completely opposite conclusions is that they don't have any data. So they're just making it up. I think that we're not short of models. We're short of data. And we need proper data. We don't need easy data from statistics that aren't properly used. And I think also we need to be more aware that qualitative and key informant data can be useful as a complement to, and sometimes even a substitute to, quantitative data. So when we're working in this space, there's a real pressure from policymakers to give them an answer. And I think we need to be braver as scientists to say that we don't know, and actually nobody knows. And when we do our models and we collect our data, we may be trying to propose something that's optimal in the perfect world, but is not possible in a political world. So we need to be thinking about robust suboptimal solutions potentially, not just the optimum. Academic freedom is probably the biggest card that we have to play, and our objectivity. So we need to be sure to keep that objectivity, keep our academic freedom, so that we can use it to best effect, while at the same time remembering that we all have our own subjective preferences and our views, and you're not a neutral player in these things. So there's a fine balance between keeping your academic freedom and objectivity and being aware that you yourself are a player. And it's very hard when you see these kinds of pictures to retain that objectivity. In terms of other things that should be looked at, I think we have started working quite a lot on hunters and on consumers, but there are other people in the chain who really aren't being looked at in terms of their motivations. So rangers, the motivations of rangers is incredibly important in determining their effectiveness. And the motivations of people who are actually negotiating treaties in the middle of the night are also important. And then there's also us as scientists. We need to think about our own motivations. And in order to improve our motivation, I'm just going to give you a quick plug at the end for a Conservation Optimism Summit that we're holding in London in April next year. And the reason for doing that is that we as scientists need to be motivated. We need to be positive and optimistic about our futures. In the face of the statistics that I gave you on my first slide, the slide towards extinction of species, we need to keep ourselves thinking about the success stories that we've had, and then learning from them in order to scale up to bigger and better things. So thank you for listening, and I'll be glad to take some questions.